Hello, everyone. I don't know if I have to say good morning or good evening, good afternoon. Anyway, we can start our today's workshop on the topic of nihilism and realism. And the chair of this workshop is Paolo Livieri. It is connected via Zoom. So, Paolo, please take the control of the workshop. Good luck.
Thank you very much to Enrico Fongaro. And thank you very much for organizing this workshop. Enrico Fongaro to put together a group of people who are interested in different topics indeed, because the title of the workshop is Nihilism and Realism, but the perspectives are quite diverse today, because we are from German philosophy to contemporary Japanese thinking through theology, both in Japan and in Europe, so to speak. So from Christianity to Buddhism. Very excited to and look forward to the presentations, but which will be two presentations. The first one by Tobias Bartneck, and the second one by Professor Paul Ziche. The structure of the workshop, as said before, is quite easy because we will have 30-minute presentation, 30 minutes presentation, followed by a 20 minutes Q&A, and then the second presentation followed by a maybe longer Q&A and discussion in the real spirit of a workshop. Said the title, which is of the workshop, which is Nihilism and Realism, I would like to introduce the first speaker, who is Tobias Bartneck from Nanzan University. Actually, is a doctoral student whose focus is, broadly speaking, Christian theology and Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, more properly, the connection between theology and the Kyōto school, specifically in Keiji Nishitani's thought. Today, we'll be speaking he has a very interesting and broad topic, which is Messianist Nihilism Buddhism from Nietzsche to Nishitani. And without further ado, I will actually leave the floor to Tobias Bartneck.
Thank you very much.
There's an echo.
Sorry, yes, I cancelled the echo. Thank you very much for the introduction. Slight correction, I'm affiliated with Kyōto University, not Nanzan, not yet, maybe for my postdoc, if everything goes well. But yes.
Sorry for that, okay.
No worries. Without further ado, is it visible? Yes. I prepared a short text. It is a very rough sketch. I have to apologize.
Someone in the admittance, but
and
yes, at
the same time, I want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to present something of my work here in this context, in this rather intimate setting of a workshop. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, to the Q&A, to flesh out some of the thoughts that I'm trying to develop in my ongoing research. So again, without further ado, I will proceed by reading this manuscript. So I will begin my short workshop presentation by first openly admitting that I will not be able to keep the promise of its somewhat bombastic title. I will, however, not indulge myself in the play of Derridian deconstruction, speaking about messianism and promises given, kept, or broken. How any talk on this topic might assume the nature of a promise given, kept, or broken, and how such a promise might relate to a discussion of Buddhism and the compassionate vows of the enlightened. The three terms of my title only mark, in the broadest way possible, the frame within which my thoughts move, and I will limit myself to drawing out some lines and elaborating on some details within that frame. I will proceed according to the steps announced in the abstract of this talk. However, my argumentation will be experimental and, if warned, be considered eclectic in style, And I will not look at the protagonists of this presentation head-on, but rather sideways from a slightly displaced angle. So, based on a few recapitulatory reflections on Nietzsche, I will develop a connection between nihilism and messianism as background for my engagement with Kyoto School philosopher Nishitani Keiji and his LifeWorks project of overcoming nihilism through nihilism. I argue that one can indeed decipher this project on its most fundamental level as a confrontation between Christianity and Buddhism, more specifically as a confrontation also between the principles of messianic love and Buddhistic compassion. So first, messianism. If Jewish messianism, following the celebrated definition of Gershom Scholem, is indeed a theory of catastrophe, then Christianity ipso facto has to be understood as the real catastrophe. It is, according to its own self-understanding, no longer just the prophetic anticipation, therefore theory, of the messianic event to come, but the real fulfillment of those prophecies as historical fact. And even if this catastrophic nature of the messianic event is taken to be, in its ultimate consequences, borrowing a word from Catholic philologist Tolkien, catastrophic, the moment of genuine catastrophe itself and its ramifications remain essential. No one, I would argue, has nolens volens given better expression to the distinctly Christian consciousness of this catastrophe than Friedrich Nietzsche. As the inventor of mimetic anthropology and apologist René Girard has convincingly argued, Nietzsche, with his pronouncement of the death of God, has not so much pronounced the end of Christian theology, or the end of the Christian era for that matter, but rather displaced and paraphrased the original truth of the gospel. The death of God has been essential to the content of the good news from the beginning, and reading Nietzsche closely, it is not only his death as such, but the manner of dying, which is decisive. In fact, what Nietzsche describes in his aphorism as is precisely the murder of God, who has, quote, bled to death under our knives. And the realization of this most terrible deed, bringing about an unbearable feeling of guilt, a guilty conscience seeking the invention of new ceremonies to make the unbearable bearable again. Even if one might say that the Catholic institution is inclined towards asserting that they have already invented the liturgical science necessary to know which ceremonies are appropriate, whereas Protestant Christians are still looking for an answer to the question posed by Nietzsche. What else has the history of Christianity, the institution of Christianity, been than the invention of such ceremonies to make the murder of God livable for those who have come to the realization of their own terrible deed, to assume responsibility for the murder of God through ceremonies and rituals of repentance? It is precisely the death of God, or the murder of God to be more precise, and its delayed realization after the fact, which explicitly constitutes the very foundation of Christianity. This is the catastrophe of the cross, which defines the messianic event as historical fact. Christianity as, in a specific sense, real messianism. However, in Nietzsche's displaced revelation of the truth of the cross, there seems to be, in fact, one difference which he introduces, which appears decidedly non-Christian. For there is no resurrection after the murder. God stays dead, he says. And yet, even on this point, Nietzsche himself remains ambiguous. Doesn't he suggest that we murderers must become gods ourselves now to live with our guilt? And would it not even be possible to draw a line from these Nietzschean questions to the theology of sanctification through participation in the Eucharistic mysteries? Indeed, even speaking strictly from a Christian standpoint, God, in a specific sense, stays dead, insofar as he continues to be sacramentally immolated on the altar of the cross in the Eucharistic mystery for our salvation. However, there is still a crucial difference. For both the understanding of the gospel and of Nietzsche, the question of how to interpret the messianic catastrophe is the decisive task. What Nietzsche most certainly negates is the theology of the upper room, that is, the divine institution of the Eucharist in anticipation of the cross on the eve of the Last Supper through Christ himself. On this institution, the sacramental function of the Church is founded. Christ turns the murder into a voluntary sacrifice. He offers himself as the true paschal lamb for slaughter in the new and eternal Passover. For Nietzsche, it is in fact this interpretation of God's murder which is to be denied. And it is precisely from this denial that the question which he raises in his famous aphorism logically follow. At the same time, and this is the only point I wish to make here in reference to Nietzsche, he most clearly gives expression to the problem for which even the theology of the upper room constitutes an original answer. The quote-unquote real messianism of Christianity therefore hinges on the interpretation of the catastrophe of the cross. It hinges on the interpretation of the death of God, just as Nietzsche presents it. Furthermore, it is on this Eucharistic interpretation of the death of God, which tradition has provided, that the logic of institutionalized Christianity, specifically the Orthodox Catholic institution, is founded. The supreme referent, the founding principle of the whole symbolic order and sacramental functioning of the church kingdom is the cross as expression of God's salvific act. It is the messianic love realized in the voluntary self-sacrifice of Christ, or, borrowing the words of Church Father Saint Maximus the Confessor, the divine death wish. Here, I lay my focus specifically on the Roman Catholic Church, as this peculiar institution and its peculiar logic have, as I will continue to argue, in fact become the institutional matrix of the West and still functions as such in our so-called secular age. Put succinctly, the supreme referent of the church kingdom is not a mythological founding principle of social order among others. The ground of authority in the church and the meaning flowing through its hermeneutic systems of interpretation is not simply derived from a mythological substance with supreme attributes, true, good, or beautiful, which demands reverence and obedience, but from love, kenotic love, to use the theological expression, that is the self-emptying of all grounds, the act of self-sacrifice of the highest in the name of love. A momentary or exceptional becoming indistinguishable of transcendence and immanence, the highest and the lowest, life and death. And the ramifications of this foundational principle of self-emptying for the church institution cannot be overstated. Nihilism. What I therefore wish to argue is a certain structural equivalence between messianism and nihilism in the Christian context specifically, as also recent thinkers such as Jean-Luc Nancy or Georges Agamben have done in their works. And I wish to lay focus especially on the peculiar institutional logic and what might be called political theological consequences that flow from this equivalence. Insofar as Christianity is founded on the act of self-sacrificial, self-emptying, that is, kenotic love, it maintains a singularly problematic relation to any social order. Christianity seen on this level is first and foremost a religion of a specific kind of self-negation, or, in the words of Jean-Luc Nancy, auto-deconstruction. As the historian of law, Pierre Legendre, points out again and again in his works, Christianity, in contradistinction to all other so-called religions of the book, does not prescribe any concrete norms of social order. Within the Christian world, there remains a structural gap between the foundational principle of authority or legitimacy and the concrete social order and legal structure founded on this principle. Legendre terms this a specifically Christian schize, and as he develops at great length and minute detail, the logic of institutions in the West to this day is determined and defined by this schize. The Christian schize reaches its defining articulation at the time of Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century, with the beginning of what historians Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy and especially his student Harold Berman have termed and discussed as the so-called Papal Revolution. This Papal Revolution signifies the conflict between Pope and Emperor, giving rise through a complex development to the necessity of further defining the Church as a legal body, eventually leading to a systematic appropriation and application of Roman imperial law for this purpose. Here, the Roman Christian institutional order, what may be called the order of imperial Catholicism, is born, and it is structured around the gap between its founding principle of authority, the name of love, and the instrumentalization and technical montage of Roman law as a purely convenient instrument of power. This is not the place to elaborate on this historical development in detail. However, I will only state what seems to me most crucial about it succinctly. In the concrete order and institutional matrix of this Roman imperial Catholicism, love reigns supreme over all law. And as touched upon above, this love is first and foremost the self-sacrificial, kenotic, and Eucharistic act of Christ on the cross. The primary purpose of the Church and its sacramental liturgical operations is to lead souls to salvation through their incorporation into the mystical body of Christ and participation in the Eucharist. As such, the institutional logic of the Church demands precisely the maintaining of this structural gap in its foundation and the systematic universalization of this schize through the propaganda of kenotic and Eucharistic love. Furthermore, since its inception, the Church has consolidated itself through a constant struggle against pagan mythologies, philosophies, and heresies. In all these struggles, what is at stake is a question of exceptionality, intrinsically linked to the interpretation and significance of the messianic event, the cross. Insofar as the Church is founded on the cross, it is founded on the concrete moment of messianic exception in history, the ongoing specific time frame of the salvific sacrifice, in the words of Giorgio Agamben, the time that remains, the liturgical apparatus of the Eucharist realized in history. I therefore argue that the Church kingdom founded on the quote-unquote real messianism of the cross catastrophe, the institution of the cross and the universalization of this supposed exceptional moment in history through the liturgical prolongation of the sacrificial act can indeed be described as the institution of nihilism par excellence. Not nihilism in a generic sense of moral decadence, and neither in the sense of a devaluation of life through degenerate Platonism, as a Nietzschean might argue, nor any false philosophy for that matter, but in a very specific sense of the Christian messianic opening of the abyss at the foundation of all social order in the name of love, the nihilism of kenotic love realized in the messianic exception, a messianic realism of love, institutionalized and universalized as the Church kingdom, inducing in history a total kenosis of grounds, borrowing an expression of Heideggerian philosopher Rainer Schürmann, in the name of love. Furthermore, employing a certain psychoanalytical vocabulary, the institutional structure of this Church kingdom could therefore be described in a very precise sense as being in its structure melancholic. The logic of Eucharistic incorporation in the real presence of Christ as self-sacrificing victim, the imitation of Christ and the rituals of penance follow a structural logic, a psychosemiotic economy most accurately captured by the Freudian description of melancholy. I emphasize, however, that in my reference to this vocabulary, I do not intend to pathologize Christianity in any cheap sense measured against any presupposed standard of psychological health. Rather, it is about understanding the structure of this peculiar institution of the Church kingdom and its foundational practices, as they have become universally paradigmatic through the centuries of their historical development. God, the supreme object of love, is lost in the messianic catastrophe of the cross, the murder of God, and yet internalized, consumed, and retained through participation in the Eucharist. The inability to sufficiently mourn this terrible deed will result in acts of self-sacrificial penance, the imitation of Christ, first and foremost as imitation of divine, self-sacrificial kenotic love. Therefore, following the thinkers mentioned above, I propose understanding nihilism as a historical phenomenon, as this specifically Christian melancholy condition, the specific consciousness and repentant guilty conscience of the murderers of God who remain religiously bound to the lost object. It is precisely the historical moment when the religious functioning of this binding begins to fail that the original problem resurfaces to consciousness in full clarity as an unbearable and unanswered question, finding one of its most memorable expressions in Nietzsche. Now, Buddhism. When Nishita Nikkeji, looking back on his life's work, famously states that his project, first and foremost, has always been the overcoming of nihilism through nihilism, I propose reading this statement through the lens of the lines of reflection sketched out above. Nishtani, since his earliest years, has always maintained a high consciousness for the historical problem of institutionalized Christianity, and specifically what he addresses explicitly as the Church kingdom and the colossal architecture of its theological system. Furthermore, he consistently maintained a critical stance towards this historical reality, and I hold that his engagement with the problem of nihilism from his Buddhist standpoint must be read explicitly in the context of the confrontation with Christianity, with this Christianity in its historical reality. In evoking the religious experience as a, quote, real awakening to reality, as he phrases it in Religion and Nothingness, Nishitani too aims at bringing the dimension of experience expressed in Nietzsche's aphorism to the front. Nishitani, however, contrary to Nietzsche, will not suggest becoming gods as a solution to the guilt felt for having murdered God. Although in principle sympathetic to Nietzsche, he recognizes in him an insufficient realization of the negativity he touches upon. There will be no new ceremonies and no self-consolidation of a will to power, assuming a mastery over the void left by God's absence. For Nishitani, Nietzsche symptomatically remains stuck at a preliminary stage of nihilism, an experience of nihility that must be overcome not through the power of the will, but precisely through a further deepening of negativity. Only then will negation, in a truly catastrophic term, become immediate affirmation and achieve true freedom. Nihilism will overcome nihilism when, after the death of God, to quote Brett Davis, great death of the will follows. What is at stake in this step from the experience of nihilism on the field of nihility, as Nishitani terms it, employing a distinctly Buddhist vocabulary to self-awareness or awakening on the field of emptiness, ku in Japanese or shunyata, Sanskrit, is, I argue, the ultimate relinquishing of the lost object, which, under the register of guilt or in the melancholic structure based on the institutional logic of the church, is still religiously clung to in the experience of nihilism. Seen from the institutional logic roughly outlined above, this move of Nishitani's constitutes nothing less than an overt attack on the very foundations of the church kingdom and its principle of Catholicity. The church kingdom, namely as the universalization of the exceptionalism of messianic love, through the operation of Eucharistic communication, the institutionalization and systematization of the Eucharistic act of self-sacrifice, melancholy divine death drive institution, and nihilism incorporated, and against this, a final releasement, Pater Heidegger, of thought from the paradoxical being of this lost object, achieved through an operation of what Nishitani terms negation sive affirmation, a negation immediately turning into affirmation, that amounts to, I hold, an acceptance of loss itself as primordial condition of being, as the awakened entrance into the reality of emptiness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Tobias. So we have plenty of time, as Rigo Fungara said before, for the Q&A and discussion. So if you have any question, please come forward. I have plenty of questions, but I leave the room to the present people there. I see. Okay, I see. Professor Ziche. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation, which really challenges my understanding also of the Nietzschean line of nihilism. So one thing I've been questioning myself while listening is, isn't it two concepts of nihilism that you are discussing? So one, the repentant, I quote you, guilty conscious of the repentant murder of God. That sounds pretty much like the kind of official Nietzsche line. And the idea that kenotic love also has nihilist connotations or elements to it. And it seems like that in the Nishitani argument at the end, you sort of combined these two notions of nihilism in a kind of two-step procedure. So you have this repentant guilty consciousness, then you can get rid of relinquish the lost object, which seems, or which reminds me of this idea of kenotic love as kind of love emptied of content. So is that an adequate way of how these things relate? And then my main question would be about kenotic love, because that doesn't really seem to be nihilistic at all, because it rather sounds like an optimist way to pass forward to salvation with lots of experiential complexity, full experiences. So what precisely is the nihilistic element in kenotic love, if any?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Well, as I see it, or as I try to relate it, especially to the Nishitanian frame, and the distinction that he makes between this preliminary stage of an insufficiently experienced negativity, which he calls in Japanese kyomu, nihility, as it is translated in English, and what he deems the true emptiness, or what he also links to his idea of reality as being fundamentally empty, and requiring a step beyond the nihility to a sufficient and full understanding and realization and living out of this negativity, I think applies to, and maybe allows me to formulate an answer to your question, to the Christian idea of kenosis as a specific self-negation, in the sense that that I see the crucial difference between what Nishitani proposes as the standpoint of emptiness, as against, in comparison, the Christian idea of kenotic self-emptying, is that in the kenotic self-emptying, a relation is maintained. A relation is maintained to the victim of the cross, to the self-sacrifice that is once and for all a means for general salvation, insofar as the believer relates to Christ as that victim and imitates Christ in a specific relation and retains that relation, so that what I describe as repentance, stemming from this guilty conscience, which I think Nietzsche captures very well in his description, without thereby already necessarily agreeing with his moral evaluation as a moral judgment, as a kind of phenomenology of this guilty conscience, captures very well, is precisely, I think, as this move of repentance, the imitation of this kenotic love gesture in a mutually mirroring relationship, which I think applies, or to which applies, what Nishitani calls the preliminary stage of nihility, wherein negativity still appears as having a kind of externalized or reified aspect that is external to the individual, not fully internalized and realized and lived, but maintained in a relation to nothingness, external. And I think that this does map onto this Christian frame, this foundational, for the Christian institutionalized religion, foundational frame of a mutually kenotic self-emptying. And for example, as in the discussion of the interpretation of kenosis of Nishitani, Hans Waldenfels mentions, it is inside the Christian theological frame, as he argues, precisely this mirroring or the imitation of kenosis, so the mutual kenotic self-emptying in which the kenotic gesture fulfills itself. So there has to be a certain form of repentant replication of that moment. But again, as I also stated in the beginning of my answer, of my reply to your question, as precisely a maintaining of that relationship. And I think the point that Nishitani is making to reach a fully lived and not just thought and conceptualized or externally maintained negativity, this relation has to be undercut. There has to be a step towards a domain that can no longer be conceived as a space of relationality, as it is in a foundational sense inside this Christian mindset. I'm sorry, a very long-winded answer, but I hope.
I need to think about it. Good, thanks.
Professor Kim?
Yes, thank you so much for your lecture. My question is very simple, but as long as I understand, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. As long as I understand Nishitani, he leads Nietzsche and also Meister Eckhart, and through reading Nietzsche and Eckhart Nishtani thinks he can find some way this is for me to follow your text. So because it is the first time I came to learn your way of thinking. So if possible, not now, but if possible, in the later in the future, I appreciate you very much if you can give me your this manuscript. I also think you can write again, and so. But anyway, I appreciate you if you could give me your text. But my question is very simple. You said in your paper, Nishtani had a so-called attack the institutional Christianity, or yeah. But can you tell me some articles or phrases where Nishtani attacks or criticized the institutional Christianity in terms of this overcoming this nihilism? So, and if you tell me that articles or phrases, then maybe it could help me very much with my studies on Nishtani. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, and I will be happy to send you a version of the manuscript that's more fleshed out, and will be grateful for the response. Is the connection still there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Yes,
okay.
yes.
Okay, thank you. And to reply to your question, yes, as I in the text itself, I quote Nishtani when he speaks about the church kingdom and its vast theological architecture. This is actually a quotation from a hitherto untranslated text. It's my own English translation, which is the earliest engagement with Christianity, explicit engagement with Christianity one of the earliest that I found from 1928. It's a very small text published in a collection called Shukyo Zakkan, so a religious miscellany, and it's the title of the text is Reihaiteki Shinko. So worshipping faith, I think, would be the translation. And inside that text, he explicitly says, he criticizes the church for standing, as he says, on a distorted foundation, and speaks and asks rhetorically whether the first thing that would have to be destroyed if Christ would actually return wouldn't have to be Christianity. Yes. So it is a very polemical essay. And what he attacks there is the worship, precisely the worship of Christ, as something that precludes the authentic experience of negativity, which for him, ironically though, is expressed on the cross, in the cry of dereliction more specifically, as he mentions in that text specifically, but is obfuscated through the systematization of worship in the institution of the church. So this is one text where I now directly refer to in my workshop presentation, which I could refer you to. And then, of course, in his main works in Religion and Nothingness, I think one could make the argument that when he goes into the genealogy of modernity, being able or making the argument that one can trace the genealogy of modernity back to problems of medieval theology, and that even what he confronts as modern atheism and modern nihilism, for that matter, have their origin in theology, in Christian theology, are unthinkable, as he says, apart from Christian theology. And furthermore, the passages where he then tries to root out what is the issue, what led to the catastrophe of modernity as origin point in theology, and confronts, for example, the Trinitarian theology, the concept of personhood in the Christian conception of God, and also mentions the persecutory exclusivist, how do you say that in English? I only have the German exclusivist, excluding, or exceptionalist character of the church institution, in fighting heresies and other pagan religions. It is a continuous line from this earliest text, I think, that one can trace out in Nishitani's thinking throughout the period of religion and nothingness until his very late years. So this would be another trace that I would follow in that regard. Yes. But I will be happy to provide the concrete references also of all my quotations in the fleshed out manuscript, which I will be happy to send.
I don't know if Professor Kim wants to reply. Okay.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions, but I see only a part of the room, so I don't know if there are raised hand on the other side of the room. So Enrico Fongro should be.
If you want, Paolo, you can put your questions, I think.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very, very much indeed for your presentation. It allowed me to see that the problem from a different point of view, actually. But it is my understanding and my questions actually come from as a follow-up to what Professor Ziche had said before. So let me just elaborate on that a little bit. Because from what I see from our presentation, we are dealing with kind of two different kinds of negativity here that we call both nihilism, which is on the one side the divine kenotic process, which is a form of negativity on the one side, with which actually Nishitani engages. And on the other side, there is another kind of negativity, which I believe you only touched upon very briefly, but also is a topic in Nishitani's engagement with nihilism in this book of the Overcoming of Nihilism, which is another kind of negativity, and precisely refers to Martin Heidegger as a follower of some of the meaning of nihilism introduced by Nietzsche. Now, this kind of new understanding of nihilism introduced by Ernst Junger, Martin Heidegger, etc., is less is not that close, I believe, to the divine kenotic process, because it actually is. It seems to me actually the opposite, because nihilism in that sense is tied to the notion of, in Aristotelian term, the substantiality. So nihilism is actually the process in which substantiality in itself is a testimony of a nihilistic turn in the history of thinking, according to a specific perspective on nihilism, which is the Junger-Heidegger interpretation of nihilism. So we have I believe, two tensions here towards two different kinds of negativity, and I don't know if they can be reconciled together. Hence, I don't know if they can be actually overcome in the same process. I was actually struck. This is the first question. Actually, the first problem. I don't have any answer, so it's a genuine question. And I was struck at the beginning. You mentioned Scholem, and actually, he has a beautiful book on the nihilism and nihil as a constructive part of religious experience in many religions. So the problem of nihil, of the nothingness, seems to me different in a certain sense from the problem of nihilism. So nothingness and nihilism are two different things. One is empty. The first one is kenotic in a sense, is a self-emptying. The other one is actually full And that is the problem for certain thinkers. Hence, my question is, are we talking about the same negativity, or are we talking about two different kinds of negativity? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your comment, for your question. Well, I do think we are certainly talking about multiple negativities and also multiple nihilisms, and I'm sure it will become more clear in the next presentation that the concept itself has a very intricate history, and there are multiple usages of that word. And so my intent is, of course, not a brutally simplified claim that this is the nihilism. But I trace out in the context of Nishitani's critique of what I deem his critique of Christianity a specific issue that I think is at stake in his discussion of nihilism, and that underlies nihilism in a very specific usage. So in that sense, it doesn't preclude a multiplicity of perspectives on that issue. But I'm not sure if I fully understood the comment in which direction it is you intended it to go. But in regard to the nihilism of someone like of Heidegger, or the discussion among Heidegger and Jünger, I do think that for example, just to stick to Heidegger, and I alluded to it in this presentation too, with my reference to Schürmann as a Heideggerian who was, in a sense, reconstructing the history of being in this Heideggerian vision as a gradual forgetting of being, as the history of the forgetting of being, the oblivion of being. That this narrative, this ontological narrative, if one still wants to call it that, that originates from Heidegger, and the specific idea of nihilism that is tied to his conception of the oblivion of being and the forgetfulness of the being question, that hinges upon, and this is how I understood the comment, the introduction of a thought of Greek substantiality, or idealism in the broadest sense, stemming from Plato. I do think that another reading, although this far exceeds the scope of what is possible to discuss here, I do think it is possible to relate this history of being, which is what I wanted to allude to with my reference to Schürmann. It is possible to relate this to the discussion of the Christian messianism as it plays out through the institutional logic of the church. So I think that the kenotic process, when taken in the direction of this revolutionary upheaval of all legitimizing foundations of social order, but also in a metaphysical sense, as hegemonial signifiers, as names of the Father, that are tested and tried throughout the history of metaphysics in the West, that this process, I think, can be shown also, or this narration can be shown to be tied to the kenosis of grounds that is induced by the messianic event and the messianic love that comes from Christianity. So I do think it is possible to relate these two, and I do think that Heidegger can be reinscribed in a theology of history, and that his being history can be shown to be part of that theology of history and have a place there. And it's an insufficient answer, and I'm not sure if this is the direction you wanted to go into, but this is how I would attempt to develop it in this direction.
No, this is exactly the direction that I wanted to go, and thank you for your answer. Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Professor Ziche? No,
Yeah, I still have a question, but if there are others, please go ahead. And Paolo, just you may leave away the title when addressing me, so that makes things easier. So let's just be Paul, and that's fine. I have a very different kind of question, and that concerns the way how we talk about nihilism. And there are some words that come up again and again, and I'm just interested in different perspectives upon these words, also different ways of concretely filling them. And these two words are fullness and emptiness. And both seem to be of key importance for discussing the phenomenon of nihilism, also the experience of nihilism. And I simply also don't know enough about the different traditions and ways of dealing with these terms. So interesting, for instance, one way to talk about kenotic love might be that's a very full experience of a very empty state. Is that a reasonable way of looking at that? It might be. So, and it might also be that both fullness and emptiness can have pretty different connotations. So one can easily imagine that things being, or an experience being full or overly full is a pretty negative experience. Whereas an emptied experience can also have positive aspects to it, but it's also possible to have it precisely the other way around. And I could imagine that in particular, if we bring together a Buddhist tradition and certain traditions in European philosophy, the connotations of these terms and the way how they might or might not interact come out pretty different. So could you say a bit more about these either small or big words that we always use in talking about nihilism?
In regard to fullness and
emptiness.
As I also said in regard to this kind of phenomenology of guilty conscience in Nietzsche, and it is easy, of course, from the let's say traditional discussion of the common usage of the word nihilism, that it is used as a pejorative idea, and it is tied to a kind of moral judgment and moral accusation, again as a kind of diagnosis of decadence and decay, or also philosophical shortcoming and corruption and degeneracy. But when I link the notion of, and this is going more into the direction of a reply, when I link the notion of nihilism to the notion of the theological notion of kenosis, I do not want to therefore make this kind of moral judgment. And this, I hope I also brought out a bit in my reading of Nietzsche, my kind of Girardian reading of Nietzsche, that it doesn't have to be tied to this kind of moral accusation in the sense that therefore kenotic love is only nihilist, is only empty. But if I understand the usage of fullness, I do not want to preclude that indeed the fulfillment that comes through participation in the Eucharistic mysteries and in this kenotic love of the messianic victim, a fullness one can arrive at a fullness or a full experience. Maybe this is indeed the sanctifying grace that is distributed, and maybe this is indeed the salvation that is necessary. Who knows? But but it is. But what I want to bring out is that there is a specific structure, or there are specific structuring effects or consequences from thinking about it in a specific way that I think the authors that I try to synthetically gather together allow to analyze and bring to the fore this structural logic, and which I also again think that Nishtani makes the object of his critique or his strategic Buddhistically inspired reinterpretation, because he deems it to be insufficient. For him, I think, taking his standpoint, he would say that this is an obfuscation of the true experience and the full realization of nihility, of negativity, of nothingness in emptiness. And therefore, he wouldn't agree with traditional dogmatic theology or ecclesiology for that matter. But I personally, I do not want to take a side in this matter. I hope this is sufficient.
Also to be continued, but we'll have time to do that. Good. Yeah. Nice.
Paolo, may
Thank
I
you.
ask a
Excellent.
question?
Of course.
Oh, Tobias, just a very broad question I would ask you also regarding the discussion we had Saturday and Friday, particularly with Anna Ruggeri. So you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, cannot speak love and Buddhist compassion. So, and the discussion was, what is the difference actually between Buddhist compassion and love? Because Anna said, Anna is a practice, she practiced Zen, and she used the word love, but what was instead of compassion? But her master doesn't agree with her and prefer to use the Buddhist word. So there was a starting of discussion. What is the difference? What could we find something communal? So I want to ask you if you can explain a little bit better. And what is the role of Buddhist compassion in the Nishitani project of going beyond nihilism through nihilism, if there is one?
Yeah, this is something that I did not touch upon, although announced in this presentation paper. But yes, this is how I would want to frame this, as I also wrote in the abstract. This point of confrontation, in that I see that the notion of love, from specifically in the specifically Christian context, is tied to this form of relationality and requires this form of relationality that does not allow for, I think, what Nishitani aims at, the real realization or the real awakening to reality in emptiness. And I think it would be, this is part of my project, so it is ongoing, and I can't say that my investigation is completed. How the notion of compassion is, especially in the later Nishitani, who becomes a much more close reader and commentator on Buddhistic texts, how he comments and takes up that notion specifically. Because in his earlier works, I think one has to say that he rather tends to positively take up the notion of agape, positively take up the notion also of Christian love, and reinterpret it through the lens of what I think is the great compassion daihi or jihi in the Japanese words, as a form of indifferent compassion, a form of indifferentism that goes beyond any judgmental distinction in the care for other beings. But it seems to me obvious that this notion or this interpretation of agape is, when speaking from seen from a Christian standpoint, a traditional Christian standpoint, insufficient, insofar as it precludes the necessarily judgmental dimension that comes with the selective principle of Christian love. A selective principle that is tied to, for example, the exclusive participation in the mysteries and the relation to this exceptional Christ, to this specific event as historical fact in history, that cannot be indifferent, and that is not indifferent in regard to those who do not participate in it and therefore fall into damnation, which is a necessary consequence of this love in its traditional notion. Curiously, what I find in the discussion of love in Nishitani, and this is something I focused more on than his explicit discussion of the Buddhist notion of compassion. Curiously, there are passages, again, also in Religion and Nothingness, where he discusses agape explicitly. And there's a kind of ambivalence because he touches upon this necessary discriminatory or judgmental aspect that comes with agape or Christian love, where he ties it explicitly to the metaphor of a sword, a judgmental thought that is needed to cut into the ego, to cut into the self, but that necessarily entails a certain form of division in the subject, a certain experience of loss. And this is a point of a confrontation that I have to look into closer. But again, this is a thread, or this is the direction to which I would develop that thread, that I do see this kind of selective principle of Christian love against the indifferentiating. This is, of course, a very, again, also simplifying, or maybe a kind of broad, painting it with a broad brush. But I would use this as a point of distinction, the indifferent compassion and the selective principle of love, with everything that entails.
I have a brief question. Paolo, can we add another question?
Yes, we have, of the other side, yes. One last question, then we can.
Thank you.
Just for a better understanding for me. So when you talk about Christian love, you talk about it from a perspective that is similar to what Jan Assmann said about Mosaic distinction, for which the concept of truth in the monotheistic religion became something epistemological, in which you have a true God, where the concept of truth is put in the religion or something like that. So when we talk about love in Christianity, for you, it's something like if we put the concept of truth in the concept of love or something like that. So there will be just one concept of love and not many concepts of loves and something like that.
Yes, well, thank you for mentioning Assmann. With his discussion of political theology and this Mosaic distinction is very crucial, I think, to understand the institutional logic that I'm focusing on. And I do think that this ties into also the topic of the exceptionalism that comes with the messianism, and the question how this exceptionalism in the foundation of the institution informs also a specific decisionism that comes with what he calls the Mosaic distinction, but that necessarily flows from the structural logic of this exceptional event aspect that is used as reference for the foundation of this institution. And the notion of love, and insofar as it retains this relation to the exception, I think, and this goes back to the question of Enrico, therefore necessarily has this selective quality, a decisionist, a selective quality that necessarily has to pick one out of the others. It cannot be indifferent. Otherwise, you lose precisely that moment of exception that is foundational to the whole logic. And this is something that yes, of course, needs to be developed, but it is definitely tied to exactly this moment too. Yes. So thank you for the recognition.
So thank you, everybody. I believe we can now move to the second presentation, and then if there are further questions on the first presentation, then we can discuss in the final section of this workshop. So I will then like to introduce, for the formal introduction, please let me use the title, but then I will go with Paul. But let me introduce Professor Ziche from the University of Utrecht. Actually, Professor Ziche is also director of the Descartes Center for the History and Philosophy of the Sciences and Humanities. And he has widely published on, I would say, realism and empiricism from Spinoza to contemporary philosophy through Schelling, which is one of his main focus. And I just recall one of the volume that I like very much of Professor Ziche, which is Landschaften 1900 Philosophie, die Wissenschaften und der nicht-regulative Scientismus from 2008. Today is actually collaborating on the project on Jacobi, I just seen, and for the Wörterbuch edited by Professor Zankaul and Professor Koch on Jacobi, who is actually one of the main topic of Professor Ziche's presentation today, whose title is Nihilism and Realism, Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi's and others' rejection of idealism. So, please, Professor Ziche, floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot for the introduction, Enrico. Thanks a lot for bringing us together here. Thanks to all of you for being here. Yes, so I'll talk about Jacobi and others, quite a lot about others, and will take us into a very different context, the period around 1800 in a specifically German context, interesting also into a very Protestant context, so that might also be a topic for discussion, whether that is relevant. And I'm doing that because this context is the context within which nihilism did become a philosophical concept. I'm not quite sure about the continuities from 1800 through the 19th century up to Nietzsche. I'll give you some ideas on that. But it seems clear that at this moment, 1800, with Jacobi and others, the concept became a philosophical topic. And that's what I would like to show you, and what I would also like to illustrate by also pictures and passages from literary texts. So let me share my PowerPoint with you, which will be normally, as usual with me, mainly pictures. The period around 1800 is extremely interesting if we look into the way how the word nihilism is used. The word itself is much older. We already find it in scholastic traditions, but it becomes a philosophical term in 1800, and interestingly, it undergoes a complete U-turn in meaning in this time. And U-turns in meaning normally are indications that something really important is happening. So think about perhaps the most important U-turn at this time, 1800, that's the way how in Kant's hands the word objective and subjective changed places. And only from then on, we do have our understanding of objective. And similar things happen with respect to nihilism. The word is older. It comes from theological contexts, where one discussed questions such as, was Jesus something in his nature of being a human being, or rather nothing? So these discussions could be labeled as nihilist debates. So let's look into the period around 1800, and then in particular in critical discussions in which the by then enormously exciting philosophical position of Kant's transcendental idealism, which I'm not going to discuss in any detail, was severely criticized. Within the first few years of early Kantianism and early anti-Kantianism, the term nihilism moved from being a label introduced as an anti-transcendental idealist label for a sound, experience-directed and religious style of thinking related to a kind of common sense existence, to becoming a polemical epithet that was attached to transcendental idealism itself. In both functions, this term is used in a critical way, as directed against transcendental idealists, but with completely opposite connotations. On the one hand, we need nihilism as against Kantian idealism. On the other hand, Kantian idealism itself is a form of nihilism. We can make related observations as to ambiguities in clearly ascribing nihilism to a certain position if you look at the style of writing employed in presenting, and that always means in critically presenting the nihilist predicament. It's pretty obvious that the nihilist position, far from being considered to be bland and just empty, proved seductively suggestive to writers. And I will refer a bit later in more detail to Jean-Paul, the great novelist, Sermon of Dead Christ, which is one of the most powerful bits of German prose, but in which Jean-Paul himself contrasts a grandiose picture of a God-emptied universe with a positively unexciting and kitschy standard picture of sitting on a bench in one's backyard garden. So we see in this period all sorts of interesting conflicts between nihilist and anti-nihilist positions. We might say in this period we encounter two landscapes of nihilism. And these are very precisely captured in a success image from much later, namely, and you all know this, Camille Flammarion's depiction of the modern predicament. Humans struggling in between the abstract beauty of the starry heavens and their mechanical workings on the left, and a well-contained sphere of a Tolkien Shire-like idyllic sphere on the right, or Jean-Paul's backyard bench on the right and the God-emptied universe on the left. Both landscape forms, interestingly, have been dubbed nihilist around 1800, and for pretty much the same reasons, namely with the intention to criticize Kantian transcendental idealism. And once we have these kind of pictures in mind, we can find similar things in many other contexts. So it's not a very good reproduction. Here we have a typical late Romanticist colored engraving of a small village in northern Bavaria, again with this completely feeling at home of persons walking sociably in the fields, and in the background, a far more abstract, almost emptied hillscape. Style considerations of the kind of hinted at already both in pictorial representations and in literary descriptions allow us to sketch an intriguing trajectory of nihilist motives into a diversified variety of 19th century contexts, and in particular into literary genres. Jean-Paul's glimpse into the depths of the cosmos closely resembles Alexander von Humboldt's, what he calls Naturgemälde, depictions of nature. But it also evokes the opening passages of Georg Büchner's bleak novella Lenz. Turgenev in Russia and Gutzko in Germany write explicitly about nihilism in the genres of novels. Nishitani is referring to these Russian traditions in his book on nihilism explicitly. Only some, and very few of these lines can be traced here. What I want to emphasize and show throughout is that all these lines will turn out to be highly ambivalent, reminiscent of the above-mentioned U-turn in the meaning of nihilism, or of the harsh collage of a sublimely dramatic world on the left and the easy comforts of the garden bench on the right side. This directly may lead to a larger interpretive hypothesis that cannot be discussed here in any detail, namely that we will also have to ask how this ambivalence in thinking about nihilism remains present at the end of the century, for instance, in the hands of Nietzsche's magisterial and, of course, most influential account of nihilism. The characteristic semantic turn in how the word nihilism was used around 1800 can be captured in the writing of one of the others in my title. a certain Jakob Hermann Oberreit, an extremely prolific author who, in the reception history, always remained pretty much at the background of things. On the one hand, and the far more prominent Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, one of the most important philosophical both followers and critics of Kant, on the other. As Jakob Hermann Oberreit parades nihilism as one of the dramatis personae in his 1787 drama, he calls it a critical drama, der wiederkommende Lebensgeist der verzweifelten Metaphysik, ein kritisches Drama zu neuer Grundkritik. This is also interesting in style terms. It's a very static drama, not much action here, but we have nihilism talking with metaphysics and with humankind. And nihilism gets the final word in this action-free drama. What's interesting is that nihilism is not criticized by this author. To the very opposite. This Jakob Hermann Oberreit argues for what he calls a philosophy of nothingness, a Philosophie des Nichts. And I have some of the German quotes in a not quite well-ordered sequence on my slide. This philosophy of nothingness has a pretty clear methodological profile. A philosophy of nothingness is a philosophy that takes the faculty of observation and the results of observations seriously. That's a quote that's only cut off slightly at the end. A pure philosophy of observation, a lautere Beobachtungsphilosophie of the nothing, erhält die Krone vor allen anderen, is the most important, the highest form of philosophy. But, so the quote continues, the crown that it has, it's depositing again in front of the throne of the all-giving God, the highest, with whom everything lives in nothingness, which lives and exists. This philosophy criticizes a philosophy that relies exclusively or too strongly upon discursive reason. It's turned against, the first quote, all scholastics, alle Schulweisen, and those purely idealizing patterns of reason that in vain want to make us into machines of being ideal. For this position, which is clearly a kind of Kantian position, he also coins the new term speculatismus. You see that people are also searching for labels for forms of philosophy, finding them, some that stuck, such as nihilism, and others that didn't make it. Speculatismus clearly didn't. While being used as a noun, the nothing in a philosophy of nothingness, this nothing is defined mainly implicitly through that what a genuinely experiential, observation-based philosophy can hold of. Erfahrung des Nichts, oh welch eine große Lehrmeisterin. Nothing is that which experience gets hold of, and that means ordinary, everyday experience. So it is possible to have a philosophy of experience of nothingness. This can be described again in strongly religious terms. The most profound nothingness, das tiefste Nichts, die tiefste feste Liebesherablassung unter alles Unwürdige Endliche, zeigt die Fülle der reinest liebevollen festen Göttlichkeit mehr als alle Wunder. If we accept in experience profound nothingness, if we submit ourselves to even the most unworthy form of finiteness, then we are going to experience the purest, the most loving, the most solid form of divineness more than in the big miracles. So nothingness here stands for a form of modesty that does not overstretch our epistemic claims and achievements. It's really interesting, and there also already is a dialogue with what you presented, this emphasis on love and epistemic modesty that's coming up here. That leads here to a positively connotated notion of nihilism in this text. Things change pretty radically when we turn to Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, who's criticizing, in particular, Johann Gottlieb Fichte as a nihilist. And he's explicitly introducing the word nihilism here. That's the last quote on this slide in an open letter to Fichte in 1799. And you see him too struggling with finding new labels for philosophical positions. Wahrlich, mein lieber Fichte, es soll mich nicht verdrießen, wenn Sie oder wer es sei, Chimärismus nennen wollen, was ich dem Idealismus, den ich Nihilismus stellte, entgegensetze. So, Jacobi says, I'm criticizing idealism by calling it nihilism. And my own position, I don't quite care what you call it. You may even call it a chimera of philosophy. I'm fully convinced that I'm getting onto something in criticizing idealism as nihilism. So in this text, it becomes clear that he turns nihilism into a critical argument against Fichtean idealism. The argument is simple. The idealist starts from only ideas in a subject's mind, and in this sense doesn't encounter anything which isn't at least potentially a figment of my imagination. So the nihilist doesn't have any kind of solid ground, the idealist doesn't have any kind of solid ground to base her or his reasoning on, and in this sense idealism can be called nihilism. However, we also see in his text a kind of philosophy of nothing attitude that is still pretty close to what we found in Oberheit. Jacobi commits himself to a Unphilosophie, a kind of non-philosophy that has its essence in Nichtwissen, in non-knowledge. And this might seem to come dangerously close to a nihilist stance. In particular, when he criticizes the scientific endeavors of his times, saying that our sciences are just plays and games. And in conceiving of these plays, the only thing what a philosopher or scientist does is organizing his non-knowledge without getting closer to a cognition of truth only for a millimeter. So sciences are forms of organizing non-knowledge, and in order to get truth, to get the truth, we need to get beyond the epistemic stances of the philosopher and the scientist, which also implies and is made possible by the fact that truth is something which is before and beyond knowledge. So he very clearly argues for a form of philosophy that doesn't follow the intellectualist and idealist strands of the Kantian and Fichtean tradition, and instead relays much more upon feelings, upon subjective experience, also upon, and that's also background of my question earlier, upon what Jacobi would also call the fullness of immediate feeling-based experience, as opposed to the emptiness of intellectualist constructions which take the intellect in isolation from the rest of what a human being is or does. So what we do find in these texts, and that's first of all an observation about the history of words or concepts, is a pretty ambiguous account of what nihilism might be. We also find pretty ambiguous evaluative stances. Nihilism can be precisely what we need as opposed to the overstretching claims of intellectualists, or it can be a way of criticizing these intellectualist endeavors as losing contact with reality. These kind of ambiguities we can further pursue when we look into authors who bring these ambiguities together in stylistically interesting forms of writing. Jacobi's critical arguments against the transcendental idealists are central for binding together a group of realist opponents of the idealists. And Jacobi explicitly uses this term realist. He even talks about us realists who criticize the idealists for losing contact with reality. So he refers to a group of philosophers. And one of these authors is Jean-Paul. The realist philosophers, interestingly, have an understanding of what we should do as philosophers that relies most strongly upon the non-intellectualist faculties, feelings, faith, and so on. The strongest realist argument they develop is an argument stating that if we want to be certain that we get into contact with reality, we need to get beyond the idealist predicament. If it's our cognitive faculties that are in charge, it may always be something which we have imagined ourselves. We can only get into contact with reality if we come to the understanding that our cognitive abilities are limited. So only there where our attempts at understandings come at an end, there we can be certain that we get into contact with reality. One of the most ambitious renderings of a nihilist predicament from an author who commits himself to this Jacobian form of realism is Jean-Paul's Sermon of Dead Christ that he introduces in his novel Siebenkäs, originally published 1796-97, so again, precisely in this period. Here we have this author, Jean-Paul, sitting in his garden, and it's both a realist and a slightly ironic caricature-like representation of this wonderful and difficult writer. In this novel, Siebenkäs, he includes a short text, very dramatic text, that is presented as a form of dream narrative. A dream narrative that asks the question, what kind of emotions and affective reactions we need in order to cope with atheism? And it's told in a dream story in which the Sermon of Dead Christ is presented as a dream, but this story, being a dream story, is framed by disclaimers. The protagonist in the novel falls asleep. He awakens on a churchyard. The dead Christ appears, descends from the heavens, and tells the protagonist that there is no God, and that humans are completely alone in the universe. And he tells the story in the most dramatically exuberant terms that directly makes us think about the barren heavens in the left half of the Flammarion illustrations. I'll just give you some few sentences to give you an impression of the style of writing. And I'm not really trying to translate it. If that is okay with you. Ich suchte im ausgeleerten Nachthimmel die Sonne, weil ich glaubte, eine Sonnenfinsternis verhülle sie mit dem Mond. And now it's Christ talking. Ich ging durch die Welten, ich stieg in die Sonnen und flog mit den Milchstraßen durch die Wüsten des Himmels. Aber es ist kein Gott. Ich stieg herab, soweit das Sein seine Schatten wirft und schaute den Abgrund und rief, Vater, wo bist du? Aber ich hörte nur den ewigen, eternal Sturm, den niemand regiert. Und der schimmernde Regenbogen aus Wesen stand ohne eine Sonne, die ihn schuf, über dem Abgrund und tropfte hinunter. Die entfärbten Schatten zerflatterten wie weißer Dunst, den der Frost gestaltet, im warmen Hauche zerrinnt. Und alles wurde leer. So here we have emptiness. Das ganze Weltgebäude sank mit seiner Unermesslichkeit vor uns vorbei. Nebel, Vollwelten steigen aus dem Totenmeer. Die Zukunft ist ein steigender Nebel. Und die Gegenwart ist der Fallende. Erkennst du deine Erde? So have all these big cosmic phenomena. The sun, eclipses, the night sky, the moon, the Milky Ways, the deserts of the heaven, storm and fogs, rainbows. And interesting, you have both fullness and emptiness in this quote. So it's an empty word, but it's also full of worlds. So it's a whirling heaven which is both full and empty at the same time. And Christ is telling us that no God exists. At the end, the protagonist awakens again. And he finds himself in serene evening glory. Und zwischen dem Himmel und der Erde streckte eine frohe, vergängliche Welt ihre kurzen Flügel aus und lebte wie ich vor dem unendlichen Vater. Und von der ganzen Natur um mich flossen friedliche Töne aus, wie von fernen Abendglocken. A serene evening scenes builds in the distance. Between sky and earth, I can sit living peacefully in a world that's not eternal. And we have this nice phrase of the short wings of the world in which I can live my small and peaceful life. It's very hard not to have a kind of comical impression upon reading that. The enormous, stylistically ambitious narrative of empty, full heavens and the stark contrasts of the simple life. Interestingly, Jean-Paul's dream narrative has been republished in Madame de Staël's De l'Allemagne as an example of novel writing, but she left out the framing narrative. So she only gave the dramatic description, clearly being fascinated by this piece of writing, and Jean-Paul was deeply disappointed. So he thought, we need the conciliatory gesture at the end. This only makes it possible for us to accept this dramatic narrative. So he's very clear about the contrast and about the necessity to get into ordinary life, the kind of Oberheit, positively connotated nihilism from the negatively connotated nihilism of an empty universe. You might say that the argument supported by the extreme stylistic contrast between the frame narrative and the dream sermon seems to be this contrast only serves to give rhetorical drama and thereby extra support to the superiority of the simplicity of a genuinely religious life as opposed to the self-serving, acrobatically artistic concept clouds of nihilism. That might also be interesting to rephrase in kenotic love terms. Jean-Paul explicitly refers to this problem also in aesthetic terms. He emphasizes that it is much more difficult to tell an aesthetically pleasing story about a local village hero than about cosmic star movements. A similar point is made in Jean-Paul's Vorschule der Ästhetik, so a theoretical text on aesthetics, which opens in paragraph 2 with a discussion of poetical nihilism. Here he talks about the spirit of the times. It's an egoist times, ich-süchtig, that rather wants to destroy the world and the universe, and that means the world of reality, in order to, or rather destroys reality, only to better be able to live in the realm of empty, free, fancy, and imagination. It's the arbitrariness of egoism, the emptiness of a life in fantasy. They despise the universe. What those nihilists, aesthetic, poetic nihilists, people imagining worlds without keeping in contact with reality, could not do, and that's what he opposes them, what he challenges them with: give us the starry heaven, sunsets, waterfalls, mountain heights with glaciers, or the character of a Christ or the heroes from the past. That's what imagination cannot do. In order to do that, we need to hold contact with reality. The universe, he also says, is the highest and the most audacious word of language. Again, you see an ambiguity here. Yeah, so he challenges the poetic nihilist to do precisely what he did in criticizing the nihilistic aspects of a world without God. So he really is struggling with this problem. What does a poetic nihilist? Mit Versäumung aller Wirklichkeit, without contact with reality, except for the small and limited reality in the writer himself, sich immer weicher und dünner ins gesetzlose Wüste verflattern, kind of diminishing, getting lost of everything in a kind of hazy, cloudy atmosphere. Or it's a painter without rules who paints the either in either with either, kind of accumulation of levels of nothingness. What the nihilist does not have is material, stuff, matter, and living form. So you see that he raises these issues both with respect to describing the human predicament, arguing for the necessity and livability of religion, and for criticizing romanticist poets and poetologists. So one example of romanticist nihilists is Novalis, so even criticizes some of the great heroes of romantic writing as nihilists. So his conclusion is clear. He wants us to live peacefully in the everyday, but the reader's experience of his writings is pretty different because of this collage of poetically, wonderfully expressed experiences of precisely the other side too. So this leads us to quite a number of interesting questions. For instance, what needs to happen in order to make the nihilist experiences into something positive? And that is also an interesting question, of course, for instance, to ask in a Nietzsche context. We can also look into the further career. I do have some illustrations here. That's an illustration with a caricature of Fichte riding with the Pope's tiara. So their Catholicism is used as a negative caricature element on a chariot, and he's clearly trying to conjure up a dream image of a naked woman from his imagination, but he doesn't quite succeed in it. It remains cloudy and hazy. It's also called the new aesthetics. So here we really have the Jean-Paul criticism of poetical nihilism translated into a caricature. One thing which I find interesting is that we can trace these ways of writing that we have in Jean-Paul throughout the 19th century. And an interesting example is Alexander von Humboldt's cosmic writings, giving us a representation of the cosmos, including the starry heavens, with an interesting combination of nature as wild, dramatic, violent, but also giving consolation and a total impression, a total painting depiction of nature that also offers a kind of salvation to humans. Very strange. So he's both describing crocodiles strangling poor cows, human tribes fighting each other. But then in the final paragraph of this text, that's the first text in his Ansichten der Natur, 1807, on deserts, also a strange way of opening a description of nature. There he says, now, still, if we are disappointed by the eternal struggle, the ungeschlichtete Zwist der Völker, if we aim at spiritual rest, we love to turn our gaze into the quiet life of plants, into the holy force of nature, into the inner drives of human beings, or towards the high starry heavens, the moving planets that move eternally in their harmonious pathways. So again, we have the starry heavens as an image of consolation, but in a world of nature that also includes drama. So that's also still an ambiguous and unsolved conflict. And it's no coincidence probably that the opening passages of Nietzsche's On Truth and Lie work with precisely this kind of cosmic narrative. Yeah, the one heroic second, and then you have all these starry sky descriptions. A very brief reminder about philosophical context. That landscape metaphors and the enormity of the cosmos are so important in the discourses on nihilism can be related to a text, a small text by Kant that has been discussed by all the protagonists I've been referring to. That's Kant's brief text on what does it mean to find orientation in thinking in from 1786. That's a text that takes seriously what Kant critically has to say about human reason and what human reason cannot achieve, and giving us ways of orienting ourselves nevertheless. Reason can never give us a total understanding of the cosmos, but still we can find means to find guidance, Leitungsmittel. That's an extremely ugly German word for orientation, or a Wahrheitssinn, a sense for truth, or faith, or a felt need of reason, or a compass, guidelines. So pretty vague, non-standard Kantian, but important terms, and that's precisely the terms that have been taken up by Jacobi, Jean-Paul, and all the other realists as ways of living successfully without the one-sidedness of idealist philosophy. And if you look at one of these authors, Thomas Wittmann, again, one of the forgotten minor figures, who's addressing Kant in a letter, and he's using precisely the kind of terminology that we find in Alexander von Humboldt. So if we are skeptics, speculants, speculatismus, doubting reality, we are cured of these doubts by the total impression, Totaleindruck of a world order, by looking at our own body or at natural reality. Then we get convinced of that these doubts are empty, that what we encounter in reality is the result of an eternal understanding, a creation of God. So we find an interesting post-Kantian discussions in which from Kant we can also take guidelines for a more sense-oriented and simple everyday way of living. Very briefly, because I'm already talking much too long, there are interesting stylistic strategies that we encounter again and again. One is repetition and iteration. We have already seen this Jacobi phrase, a painter that paints either, with either, in the medium of either, or Weben eines Webens. It's just hazy haziness. There's an important background text for this, and that's a famous poem by Albrecht von Haller on eternity that is quoted everywhere in this time, where he shows that just accumulating enormous numbers of the same doesn't get us towards eternity. It's just what Hegel would call bad infinity of repeating the same all over again. So we need to get beyond this repetition, beyond thinking in series, towards total, full impressions. We also find typical metaphors, all of which are ambiguous. One is the metaphor of mountains, fogs, and clouds. Sorry for the typo. Mountains, wonderful, but, and that's again a quote from another theoretical text by Jean-Paul, for the idealist, he's climbing up to heights where one becomes just dizzy. The air becomes thin. No concepts are sufficient. We have to work with empty language and try to climb up ever higher, but losing contact with everything. And you can find expression for that in quite a lot of romanticist landscape paintings, which would thus give expression precisely to the nihilist dangers of idealist stances. Similar remarks and metaphors in many other contexts. Another interesting thing is that the ethereal, the atmospheric clouds and fogs can be used ambiguously. So, for one, as that which binds together a complex scenery, but also as something which makes things vague and opaque. Another important metaphor for this time is oysters and snails. They are stable, wonderful, they are self-contained, living in the certainty of their own house, which they always carry with themselves, but they are also pretty poor beings because their ways of acting are pretty limited. So we find an entire series of typically ambiguous metaphors for describing the human stance, all of them working with dichotomies such as high-low, external, internal, stable, and unstable. And once we start thinking like that, we can think of quite a lot of romantic landscape paintings as precisely illustrating this predicament. So I would challenge everyone who says, which is the standard reading of this painting, that the idealist gaze via a subjective observer. It's much rather someone who stands on a peak point without any idea how we've got there, where we can get from there, whether it's stable or unstable. That, for me, adds a pretty interesting dimension to these paintings. Okay, let's start to summarize things, and I can't give a presentation at this one without showing my favorite painting at the moment. That's a Carl Gustav Caros landscape painting, which also gives us a pretty dramatic and unstable image of mountain reality, also of clouds up and low. So clouds as structuring reality and as making things obscure. And we can perhaps summarize what we can learn from these very short excursions into artistic and aesthetic practice, that we get the challenge to capture fascination of nature within artistic means. And it's not clear whether the realist gets us closer to our fascination with nature or the nihilist. And in this combination of the two nihilist landscapes I've been showing you, this question is pretty much left open. with a sort of secret fascination with the nihilist seductions. Some very brief summarizing remarks. What we seem to have to do is we need to capture totalities, getting hold of totalities, while still delimiting, making clear one's own personal position. That's what the Friedrich person standing on the mountains above the sea of the fogs asked us for. So how can we do that? We cannot do that by reason. And nihilism explicitly states how difficult it is to say anything at all about the totality of things. We also see that the forms of nihilism that get criticized around 1800 result typically from faultily isolating one or a few of our faculties from the rest. So that suggests that we should ask for how can we arrive at a fuller understanding of reality by making use of the full set of faculties that the human beings has, which in particular also includes the emotional and feeling related dimensions. Which also means that we should get less egocentric. We have seen this criticism of egoism, which again gets us into these religious connotations. There are all sorts of strategies. We might say supercharge the feeling dimensions of humans as a route to capturing totalities where reason fails. Think of a term such as a truth sense. Capturing truth as a sense experience and not an abstract construction. Or we could, on the other side, try to give reason an emotional dimension. That is something for the Jacobi experts, where Jacobi, for instance, always constructed the term reason as deriving from vernehmen, from perceiving what's happening around us. A phrase that summarizes these ideas is a phrase from another minor philosopher of this time, Eschenmayer, who wrote an 1803 book on the transition of philosophy to non-philosophy, where he claims that we need to change the pride of philosophy into the demut of religion, the modest attitude of religion. A key step in doing that is focusing everywhere upon concretized experiences. And that's why I do find the fullness and emptiness terminology so interesting, because we might say what we need is the fullness of experience. We might also say we need to empty ourselves from the prejudices of the pride of philosophy, and this gets us into this fullness of experience. So these empty and fullness dimensions are very strongly intertwined here. We need to get from the fascination of untouchability to a form of enjoying homeliness. And in this sense, you might say what nihilism around 1800 does is to discover and to exploit and potentially to overcome the gap between feeling at home in the everyday and having to relate to and assume the existence of something that is absolutely beyond our reach. Or we need to try to find a way of relating the everyday to that which is beyond our reach. This should not be achieved via a form of reduction. And that's important for all of the authors I've been presenting to you. And it's interesting to see that we have quite a number of options for what non-philosophy and nihilism in this period might mean. Orienting ourselves in a realm of nothingness, or orienting ourselves without fully explicit guidelines, or losing our orientation in a world in which standard accounts of where we might rely upon start to fail. And this I would like to take as the summarizing remark on the conceptual status of these debates in 1800. That's fascinating questions. We do not really get a final line of reasoning, but we get very strong arguments and very strong texts trying to open up a field for discussion alongside precisely these problems of how orientation and nothingness can come together. And in this sense, we can find an agenda for thinking about nihilism starting off in this period. Thanks for your attention. Much more could be said. I'm stopping here and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much, Paul. So very, very indeed rich presentation. So I leave room for questions, asking always Professor Funker to help me understand if on the other side of the room there are raised hands.
Yes.
Yeah, we have a question in the room, Paolo.
Okay, yeah, please, yeah.
This is a very rich presentation for me because it's about what I'm researching for just now, but from another perspective, of course. And when you quote John Paul, it comes to mind to me of one book of Amitav Ghosh, that in Italian is La Grande Cecità, but I don't remember the English name of the book, in which he said something like that now in front of the climate change crisis or something like that, that we are not able anymore to write about the war, about write the epical stories or something like that. We only write novels that are individualistic stories or something like that. And it seems very clear the connection between the nihilistic crisis and if you can say so, the crisis that we live now. And I don't know if you can see a connection between these two moments of the history or something like that.
Yeah.
And if this type of connection could be the you in a certain sense you said that before, but if I can ask you more briefly, if this connection can be the centrality of the individual life, individual body, even in the story, in the story that we tell, that we write, and the imagine that we make in certain sense.
Yes, thanks a lot. You need to tell me more about your project. That is a hugely intriguing question. So I have said a bit about these more stylistic and genre issues and how to give expression to the human predicament. With what we find in these 1800 debates is indeed a conflict between ways of expression that were thought to be egocentric, egoistic, even narcissistic, and others that are more open to reaching out to other human beings, integrative, and so on. And to some extent, this goes coupled with genre decisions that the form of the big novel, of course, is something important, certainly for Jean-Paul, with also a kind of reading experience that includes a social style of reading, as opposed to expressing first and foremost the individuality of the author in a lyrical poem. So this contrast is made time and again. Of course, these simple oppositions never work. we do have extremely individualistic novels in this time. And we also have these nihilist elements in the Jean-Paul novels, and they're never harmoniously integrated. So it's the most important, the simplest answer I can give is that it is an important field of contestation, and authors are really looking for ways of writing that are adequate to the adequate form of doing philosophy and adequate form of interacting with other humans. It's also remarkable that the Russian writers which make use of nihilist ideas do this in the form of big novels, in Turgenev, Father and Son, and in Dostoevsky, which in a way, all of these texts pose the question, how can we live with the nihilist predicament? And in asking that, okay, Jean-Paul asked this question, and he tries to answer it in a way saying, the fact that we can live and that we can depict life in the form of a novel already shows that we are beyond the nihilist predicament. So it's a kind of proof by implicit contradiction that that's not the way how we exist. And it might be very interesting to ask a similar question to the Russian nihilist novels. It's also, we could also look into these shorter novella-like forms in Büchner and Gutzko, which are in a way far more brutal than the large novels, and try to experiment with the genuine expression of nihilist experience, and then in a short form. And it might be interesting to ask how these short forms of getting expression of nihilist predicaments sort of blow up into the enormous sprawling Russian novels. But that's pretty much an open research question, but people are very carefully thinking about the adequate aesthetic practice that can give expression to these predicaments. And in Jean-Paul's theoretical text, we find this reflected already on a theoretical level.
Thank you. Other questions? I have a couple, if I may.
Yes,
There
please.
are no questions. So thank you very much. Indeed, there are a lot of things to discuss. Let me pick just two. I would like to, if you could say a little bit more. You mentioned the notion of Gefühl, feeling in Jacobi. Yeah. How do you connect then this notion to a way to overcome the nihilistic way of thinking reality, first, and second, which is connected also to this, I believe, is that you didn't mention, but I actually sense it was behind your presentation in a sense, as the answer to a nihilistic ontology of reality, so the emptiness of reality, is the fact that both Jacobi and Kant, and I would say also Fichte, seem to connect the everyday life and the richness of ontology that the everyday life has with infinity and somehow the danger of emptiness that infinity brings with itself. They seem to bridge these two dimensions in the practical way. So the practical dimension is precisely the dimension that allow us to overcome any metaphysics with a concrete addition in the ontology that the practical life brings with itself, and the connection to the higher dimension of reality, which is the infinity of the practical value, the ethics, the practical values. If you think this is a way. I have a third hidden question that would address the Schelling scholar, but I leave for the end, maybe later. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. One of the most interesting things concerning feelings and the role of feelings in this period is that we get a large number of novel forms of feeling and novel roles for feeling. So we have a traditional division of labor saying feelings are subjective, are personal, whereas understanding and reason are objective and shared and able to be shared with others. However, we see, and precisely these authors, in Herder, in Jacobi, and quite some others, that this dichotomy is overcome by giving to or ascribing to feelings tasks which traditionally belonged to what has been called the higher forms, higher faculties of the human mind. So a typical example is the one term I've been using, Wahrheitssinn or Wahrheitsgefühl, truth feeling. So the point there is that I may reason about something being truth as long as I may, but that doesn't convince me. Being convinced is an experience, and it's a feeling-based experience. I can go, typical example that's also used in these texts, I can go step by step through a mathematical proof, accept every step, but still don't grasp the proof in its totality. And at a certain moment in the morning under the shower, I get the feeling, now I have it. Now I've seen it. Now I feel it. And without this feeling, truth simply doesn't work for me, or it doesn't exist for me. That's also, interestingly, a term that has an important career throughout the 19th century via authors such as Jakob Friedrich Fries and others, and which resurfaces again around 1900. So that might also be interesting to discuss in relation to Nietzsche. For him, clearly, truth also is related to very strong feelings, and it's not a matter of abstract deductions. So that's one of the important things to be aware of with respect to feelings, that it's not so much the claim that up to now we have neglected feelings and we simply need to pay more attention to them. They get much stronger roles and functions. Even in what up to then has been called the purely theoretical or also purely practical matters in Kant. So there's a very enigmatic footnote in Kant's critique of practical reason, discussing the feeling of respect, Achtung, which is the kind of feeling that the moral law inspires in me. And there Kant has the strange remark that it's a self-produced feeling, which is something which shouldn't exist in the Kantian framework, because feelings are passive, receptive, and active means making use of understanding and reason. But we've got one feeling that we produce ourselves, and that's luckily the kind of feeling that corresponds to the categorical imperative. So one of the interesting experiences that all of these authors had is that you can find in Kant himself ideas that get us beyond the dichotomy between feelings and understanding, also between theoretical and practical reason. So there's a kind of official Kantian answer saying all of the problems we have with reason in theoretical context, so us being unable to grasp totalities, can easily be solved in practical terms in the realm of self-determining our actions. But that's not quite what I think all of these authors, including Jacobi, found probably the most fascinating point in Kant, and that's these small bits in Kant where Kant himself offers us concepts where these dichotomies break down. That's self-produced feeling. That's the truth sense that we have in Kant. That's these forms of orienting ourselves, which can be done in practical terms, but which Kant describes in terms that do not quite fit his ethical philosophy. So none of the readers of Kant in those first years could have a clear image what Kant is up to. It's also novel and difficult to understand. And for precisely these reasons, I'd say they did become so fascinated with precisely these small bits which concretely help us in thinking along with Kant. So in a way, that's also my answer to your second question. Yes, we do have a kind of practical solution to theoretical problems in Kant, but we also have small moments in Kant that go beyond the theoretical practical division of labor in philosophy. And these moments, I have the impression, became particularly fascinating for this generation of realists. So you see that all of them commented upon these small orientation essay, which is sort of surprising, because it's looking for Kantian means to get beyond Kantian problems. And indeed, asking us to think in a novel way about what feelings can achieve.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Further questions?
May I, more than a question, is some provocation or because somehow today's workshop started in Utrecht in May when I was a guest of Professor Ziche, and I gave some lectures on Nishida, and then we spoke, and I said, oh, yes, because the question of nihilism is absent in Nishida's philosophy, different from Nishida.
Yeah.
And then I said the young Nishida was very fascinated by Fichte and and then Professor Ziche told me Fichte, but then somehow the problem of nihilism is
present. Yeah.
So I want to ask you, to everyone who read, for example, An Inquiry into the Good of Nishida. So my idea is, if Jacobi or Jean-Paul had read Nishida's An Inquiry into the Good with all these Fichtean idealistic elements, would they think that Nishida's philosophy is a nihilist? Because at the same time, for example, Nishida give a very much more importance to feelings than to knowledge, to the role of the religion's experience, the importance of the everyday experience. So there are a lot of elements that probably would spare him the accusation of being nihilist, but at the same time is completely idealistic philosophy, at least the So what do you think? You, Paolo und Paolo and the other?
Oh, I'm not sure whether I'm the person to answer this question, because my understanding and knowledge of Nishida is I have been reading Inquiry into Good, but it's for me very difficult to place it. One answer is that is related to what I just said. What I just said in answer to Paolo's questions, what we find in these 1800 debates is pretty delicate negotiations, in fact. So there is very strong polemics of idealists against realists and vice versa, as I've shown in this caricature image. And that's just one example of the degree of aggression that is at work here. However, and that's what I try to illustrate with the Jean-Paul remarks, it is a delicate balance. And what happens if I, for instance, turn the human faculties that a Fichte is using into something which is at the same time both intellectual and emotional. So if I phrase it like that, this directly might fit what we have in some of the realist authors of the time. And that seems to be perfectly feasible. And we can then ask, what do I have to give up from the orthodox, say, Fichte or Kant account? And one thing that one has to give up is the attempt to arrive at an ordered picture of the workings of the human mind by introducing subdivisions. That doesn't seem to be like such a big problem. It gets a big problem as soon as one has the inclination to privilege one of these elements above the other. That's what the realist would say is precisely what goes wrong in Fichte. He's privileging one of these elements, human self-production, above the others, and that leads to these egoist, narcissistic, atheistic implications. If we give that up, okay, no problem. And we can interestingly find traces in Kant, also in some readings of Fichte, for not doing that. So done like that, it's perfectly possible to be idealism inspired, as long as we do not read this as an exclusionary position. So it might, you don't really have quite this term. We might even call this a Catholic, in the classical sense of Catholic, inclusionary reading of idealism. And maybe that's precisely something that we can find in Nishida, and also something which resonates with some Buddhist traditions, more so than with the Protestant traditions within which a Fichte and others operated. But
can you just say something before?
Yes, one moment. Okay, I try to. The opposite pole. Push always the wrong button. Okay.
Well, thank you for the really informative and inspiring talk, especially for giving importance to Das heißt sich in Denken orientieren, which is a text which is often underestimated, but to me it's really essential because, in 50 pages, something like this, you can find the Kant method clearly, even beyond the critical path that everyone knows.
Yeah.
And another point which is essential to me is the fact that you enhanced not only the theoretical reflection in your speech, but also not just the aesthetical one, but different languages for speaking of theoretical stuff. And to me, this is another essential point. Regarding this topic, and yes, with Professor Fongaro, we have already said something about this, because I think there's a sort of contrast in our position. I think that what is relevant in this debate is the presence of the dialogue, the possibility of dialoguing. So, as you were saying, not stating, this side has the reason, this other side has the reason. So realism is right, idealism is wrong, or the opposite. We must stress the dialogue between the two parts, because then we have some points of view which are all if we can say like this, which are all good, but the important is not focusing on just one radical point of view. So I would say I am right now working on the category of distinction because of this, because on the one side, we need to give importance to emotion, to reflection, to sensibility, and it's something that Western tradition can lack sometimes. But on the other side, to me, it's relevant also not trying to unify too much and reducing the distinction, which is probably a problem in the early Nishida so it's something that maybe becomes somehow better, or on which Nishida can reflect more in his later works. But just saying, in the end, there is no distinction. It's not a wise position to me, because exactly the dimension of the dialogue comes down. The necessity of feeling this distance, when you speak of nihilism. I think that the positive attitude of nihilism is enhancing this distance, and it's something that also Kant does, stating, okay, there are some limits. Now I'm using the word that I use in my research. There are these limits, but this is the positive attitude. We can use our reason not to overcome them, but to get an orientation, to find our way. So the important thing is saying that there are distinctions and going beyond them in our way. So it won't be an absolute way, but this is the good thing. God is dead. Probably this is not the best version, but since we cannot reach God, we can elaborate our version, which is what you were mentioning in Jean-Paul, the serenity in the evening, when he discovers that when Christ says to him that God is not present. So this is somehow it's a work in progress, because it's somehow the result of my PhD research, but also the beginning of my postdoc. So it's still a work in progress.
Interesting. Probably that's again one of these highly ambiguous situations. So on the one hand, the realists oppose the isolation and self-superiority assumptions of the idealists. That sounds like a kind of harmonizing, embedding attitude. We shouldn't isolate ourselves. We should feel us being unified united to everyone and everything in the universe. There are also strong Spinoza elements at work here. However, you might also say it's precisely this attitude that makes it difficult to enter into meaningful dialogue, because it also has, it's strategically introduced as arguing against an idealist reduction of everything else to my representations and my ideas, but it has its own reductionism in itself by leveling out differences. So put like that, it's a kind of Hegelian situation. And it's really interesting to see that Jacobi and all these others always insisted on individuality as being an important category, in particular the individuality and personality of God, but also of human beings. For instance, by emphasizing the necessity to work with the fullness of the human capacity set. So, all of us are identical in terms of understanding, but not in terms of emotions and affections. So if we take this together, we get a better picture of individuality. But they also need to balance this with, individuality is important, but it must not become the individuality of one-sided idealists. So that again is walking a very tightrope between these two extremes. And the typical, or one of the arguments you get against this realist attitude is that it indeed makes it impossible to account for that which makes a human being genuinely human, but just emphasizing a kind of leveled out, this kind of simple rustic life in the garden. That's not what makes human life exciting. In a way, that's the kind of oyster-like existence. So yes, it clearly is a problem which clearly is at issue in those discussions, but which can symmetrically be used from both parties against the other party. It seems to be pretty characteristic of the state of debate at the time.
Further questions?
I'm waiting for your Schelling scholar.
or your own answer to the Nishida challenge that Enrico has raised.
For me, an answer to, but I believe Tobias had almost raised his hand, maybe.
Almost, yes.
Oh, yeah. So please, if you want to formulate your question, or
I'm not sure if it will turn out a question, but what I found curious. So first of all, I was very intrigued by the reference to the positive use of the word nihilism, which I found very, it's very highly informative, and not least because I do think that this whole debate and back and forth does connect on many levels with what is happening in Japan, in Japanese philosophy, especially the Kyoto school, drawing on the Buddhist sources. And one of these, and I think it might turn out more common than a question actually, but we just had opportunity in a different workshop to discuss one of the later texts of Nishitani's, where he kind of reworks these basic themes of negativity, of not nihilism, but nihility, and what he considers emptiness, and the transition between these different experiences. And what happens there is, I think, very much comparable or resonates very strongly with this move towards the fullness of immediate sense perception, of aesthetic sensibility, also art as a way of being able to express this, and art remaining though in a certain ambiguous tension, with the religious domain. This all comes up very much explicitly, so in Nishitani, and that I found. Yes, very, very curious how many of these themes were resonating.
Okay, so that of course, it's great to hear that, and it's so one thing which I really find interesting also for further discussion is the terminologies we use. So that's also why I've been asking about that. And typically, fullness and emptiness, that's something which we certainly can use in Buddhist context, but I've given you this one quote where you had both of these terms within one quote from the 1800 debates. It's also interesting to see that this motive too is walking this tightrope, because, okay, when Jean-Paul is showing us the fullness of ordinary life, that's not a very exciting form of life that he's showing us. Yeah, and he has an aesthetic argument to give added support to it. I'm saying, look, but it's just so difficult to draw an interesting picture of simple life. And this aesthetic problem shows that, yes, indeed, that is a good instance of fullness, far more so than the more dramatic experiences which are so easy to describe. But it's absolutely not straightforward to get clear about what fullness here actually means and how I can differentiate between different degrees of fullness here. He even has, I had this on one slide but didn't comment upon it, a strange phrase where he says, so fullness is only possible a full description is only possible of emptiness. Whereas every description of fullness will to some extent remain empty. And that's precisely this aesthetic problem of rendering simple life, which also is a topic that pervades quite a large number of 19th century texts. So you have this first novel by Adalbert Stifter, Der Condor, where a daring female explorer goes with a balloon into the stratosphere. Almost literally the same description of the starry heavens as you have it in the empty Christ description. But then she got afraid, and the expedition finally fails. And she returns to the simple life of a female in 1840. So there, this Jean-Paul combination gets added dimensions because it has a gender dimension, education dimension, a discovery dimension, but it's pretty much the same kind of contrast, and it's one-to-one the same style in which people are talking and writing about these experiences. So that's why I find it so important to have the style dimension added to it. And Nietzsche, of course, he's also working within precisely these style predicaments. It's not an answer, but it's
what I would, I mean, this is maybe going more into the formal question, but a theme that I kind of also I alluded to, and which I also heard from the quotations that you gave from starting with Jean-Paul, is the theme of a kind of disillusionment, and then also, in a certain sense, a work of mourning. In that this whole dimension of awesome pluralities and multiplicities of experience, and then also again the homecoming or the descent into the normalcy of ordinary quotidian life, kind of seems to require this moment of letting go of God, of something. I mean, literally, in you started with Jean-Paul. It starts with a message: I looked for God everywhere; He's not to be found. But on the contrary, you get precisely this whole, as you also described it, pictorial description of. So how do you, to phrase it as a question, how do you see in this whole debate the role of this melancholy mood, mourning work? What can you add a few words to this?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I've been using quite a number of times this metaphor of walking a tightrope. And there's one way of describing that, and that is indeed having seen both sides of the problem. And that's what you have in the Jean-Paul story. I have experienced this dramatic sermon, and now I'm back, and the first sentence upon being back is, now I can believe in God again. Now I can adore God again. Jetzt kann ich wieder Gott anbeten. So that seems to say, yes, I need to have this experience of being endangered, the threat of loss. I don't really see strong arguments that it is necessary to have this, to have both sides of the experiential equation. And if we take this idea of fullness seriously, that seems to imply that I can, with confidence, rely upon this fullness, even if I didn't have this complex experience. And that's perhaps the most, a pretty optimistic message. So even if I didn't have this oscillating experience, the threat and the loss, I still can rely upon the profoundness and the fullness of living experience. That might also be really interesting to ask about Nietzsche. So, of course, in Nietzsche, it seems to be necessary to have gone through the experience of having murdered God. And if that even seems to be an argument against simple solutions, that they do not have this drama. But in the 1800 context, I don't see strong arguments for having gone through this process. But that's a heuristic that still needs to be applied to these texts. And I thank you very much, because that's something I keep in mind when rereading the text.
Thank you very much. Indeed. Actually, you also reached 6 p.m. So actually,
Yes.
maybe there is time for another comment or question, or done.
Yes, no problem.
Yeah, there is maybe a hand by. Yes, Marinucci, Dr. Marinucci, you have a question to ask, I believe.
Okay, he's asking by chat. He says.
By chat, yeah, he's writing. Oh, because it's in a public place, I believe. So please write it down so everybody can see the chat, I believe. Yeah.
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 Look, good to see you, Lorenzo.
Lorenzo's right.
I would love to hear more about the emergence of the rhetoric of myths. Do we have earlier examples? So you know that I'm very fond of this rhetoric of myths, both in literary texts and in paintings. So if I think of the landscape paintings I've seen in Tokyo National Museum, we clearly do have a long prehistory of, even intercultural prehistory of cloud and mist and fogs and interplay between mountain forms and trees and clouds. There are some important, again, 1800 steps taken towards changing our way of looking at these phenomena. And one of the important steps is Goethe's investigation into cloud forms. So that's been one of the really surprising discoveries, that there are stable types of cloud shapes, which sounds completely counterintuitive because it's the most volatile and untouchable and hazy thing, but we do have stable forms. So this really gave new attention to these concepts. Also, there has been quite some research in the natural sciences, not only on meteorology, but also on other phenomena that could best be described in these atmospheric terms. So you also had nerve atmospheres, magnetic atmospheres. So all these difficult to understand and difficult to model natural phenomena, for all of them, clouds, fogs, atmospheres were prime candidates for providing models to understand them. So there is quite some input. Another interesting development is the interest in fragments as representing totalities, which you have in writing, but which you also have in painting. Yeah, so at this moment, we also have an emergence of fragments from nature as representing totalities, and that also gives rise to cloud paintings. But of course, we do have clouds in Chinese and Japanese landscape paintings. We have clouds in Raustal's pictures of Harvey. We have it all the time, but there are some distinctive developments that heighten the interest and the importance of these phenomena. Yeah, that's probably about as far as I can get here.
Thank you very much. Is there any more question? No?
You have a question,
So,
Paolo? Conclude
it is such a long question. It would require such a long answer. Maybe it's better not to, but it would just referring to Schelling, the Convitato di Pietra, maybe today, with the reference to the myths. There is a specific notion, term, concept in Schelling, the later Schelling in the Weltalter. I'm thinking about Lauterkeit, which is translated with purity or lucidity or translucidity in English, which refers to the a certain stage. But Schelling is, for me, actually important here because it seems to recognize in the history of religion idealism and realism as part of the development of the Gottheit in itself. Yeah. But just a reference would require. But I wanted to ask this question to the Schelling scholar that Professor Ziche also is. So that's all.
Yeah. One of the interesting things with these terms in Schelling is that they always operate at the interface between something which is a very clear and translucent and unified unity, and which still has at the same time the possibility to be a starting point for processes, which seems to assume that it cannot be fully unified and integrated, and also not fully lauter in this sense. And that's one of the big struggles for Schelling, how to combine these two aspects. In order to get something going, we need conflict, we need difference. So that would be Alessandro's point too. We need tensions. On the other hand, it is important and desirable to be able to talk about purity, Lauterkeit, things being fully integrated and fitting together. And it's in these contexts that Schelling is using these terms. And one of the interesting things here that may be an interesting way of relating this to some of the topics we've been discussing today here is that Schelling is using quite a lot of concepts and metaphors that are taken from very concrete experiences. So you have this Lauterkeit, you have this hunger and thirst and sharpness and milde, mildness. So all of these terms sort of cohere in their being on the apparently over concrete, while also giving a very abstract meaning to these concrete qualities. There's a long prehistory here in theosophical and pietist arguments. And in a way that also is precisely probably briefly been referring to how to bring together integration and difference, personality and comprehensiveness. So and if we put it like that, that's also a program for bringing together idealist and realist motives. So that we should elaborate on these topics and aspects, and then we probably could detect interesting links between these Schellingian topics and what I've been presenting in my lecture. Schelling is using this term realism quite a lot in his text, and it's positively difficult to state whether and from which moment onwards he might be a realist or an idealist or a combination of both. And I have been claiming in an article that he has quite a lot of realist leanings, at least from his middle period onwards.
Thank you very much. Enrico, if you want to say some final words.
Yes, I think there are no other questions. Probably we can finish here today. For me, it was very, very inspiring. I've learned a lot from both speakers, so I thank you very much. And I hope that also the people join via Zoom has a similar experience. And thank you also to you, Paolo, for leading the workshop. And yes, I hope that we can have other opportunities to work together in Nagoya or in Utrecht or somewhere in the world. And today is only one step of our communal research. And yes, so thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you all. Yeah, and thank you, Enrico, very much for everything.
Thanks, Enrico. Thanks, Paolo.
Thank you.